The Necron are ruthless, undying killing machines, an ancient and terrible species hell-bent on universal domination and the subjugation of all living things. In today's video, I'll show you my take on building and painting an ancient, grimdark and terrifying Necron Flayed Lord, using various techniques like pre-weathering and special effects, and I'll also be showing you the kind of results you can achieve using Villainy Ink Phase 2. I am Black Chalice Studio, and you're watching the Grimdark Compendium. My intention here with this Flayed Lord was to give it a serpentine, hunched and feral look. To begin with, I added the flayed one claws onto the ends of the arms, and also added an extra section of spine just to increase that hunched over, bestial look a little bit more. I then created a tail of sorts by wrapping one thinner gauge of wire around a thicker and adding a few sections from the Necron Gorse Blaster along the way. The final step here was to create some patches of flayed skin using a mix of green stuff and brown stuff pressed into a sheet and then sculpted and cut into shape and applied to the miniature. Just to finish things off, I added some skulls and bones to the base, which are built up using cork and texture paste. The first stage of our pre-weathering here is physical distressing. I came in with a scalpel blade and gently chipped, cut and scratched at the armour plates, creating small marks and battle damage. And for our first texture pass, we're going to use AK Corrosion Texture Paste. This is applied to both the armour and the skeleton, mainly in the deepest recesses, building it up over 2 layers to increase the textured effect. I'll apply this neat from the pot with an old brush, and as soon as it's on the miniature, I'll wipe my brush off, come back in and feather away at the edges, creating a smooth gradient. Our secondary texture is going to be Vallejo Thick Black Mud. This is applied mainly to the bottom of the legs, the cape, any areas that are quite close to the ground. I went fairly heavy with this pass here, just to imply that he's really old, ancient, crusty and decrepit. This is how we're looking so far, with the pre-weathering stages complete. You'll also notice here that I decided to go with an alternate head from the one I started with. Moving on to the priming stage for this miniature, I come in with Stynel Res Black. This is applied in 2 to 3 thin passes at around 25 psi through the airbrush. The base coat for the flesh is going to be Ammo Atom Putrid Flesh. I build this up in 3 to 4 thin, transparent layers at around 25 psi again through the airbrush. And for the highlight colour on the skin, we come in with GW Deepkin Flesh, applied in the same manner, just covering less area than the previous step. And while I have the airbrush out, I'll load up some Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White and apply a few thin zenithal coats over the base, mainly focusing on the skulls. Moving on to the base coat for the armour plates, I'm going to come in with Pro Acryl Magnesium. I wanted to convey the impression that the armour is an ancient and exotic type of metal. I thin this down a touch with some water and then work a lot of the pigment off my bristles, as you can see here on the back of my glove, and then begin with a stippling technique. By using stippling, you'll build up an irregular finish and a slight texture, which is ideal for our purposes here. This is applied over 2 to 3 thin coats, just building up the opacity each time. For our first highlight on the armour, I'm going to add a touch of Vallejo Silver into the Pro Acryl Magnesium. I'll carry on with a stippling technique here with thin paint, focusing more and more towards the upper edges and places that light would catch. Because we're using thin paint and a stippling technique here, this will give a really nice mottled look to the armour as we continue. For our second highlight, we just add a touch more Vallejo Silver and carry on with the previous method, focusing more and more towards the top edges. And for the final highlight on the armour, I add a touch more silver and just focus on the extreme upper edges. The base coat for the claws and the skeleton is going to be Ammo Atom Gunmetal. For the claws, my application method was just standard base coating. For everything else, I went with the stippling technique again. As before, thin this down and build it up over 2 to 3 thin passes for opacity. And finally, the base coat for the gold parts is going to be 1:1 scale 75 Necro Gold and Vallejo Metal Colour Gold. This is one of my go-to colour mixes, and I keep a pre-mixed bottle of this handy. It gives a really nice old, weathered and slightly greenish looking gold. Build this up over a few thin layers again, and that's pretty much all of the base coats finished, and we're ready to move on to the weathering. This is how we're looking so far with all of the base coats applied. Now we're getting into the fun stages of this project. To begin with, our unifying wash is going to be Villainy Ink Goon's Grime with a touch of Ichor the Damned added, just to darken it up slightly. I'll add just a touch of mineral spirits to make it flow slightly better and apply this to all of the armour and the skeleton. I'll apply it fairly generously and then go around and wick up the excess from the crevices with a damp brush. We'll then use a blow dryer on medium heat for around 30 seconds just to flash off the spirits in the unifying wash. While I'm letting the armour wash dry, I'll move on to Villainy Ink Dystopian Brown and apply this slightly thin with spirits to all the patches of flesh. Once the first wash passes down, I'll come back with a second, more focused one, concentrating on things like the holes, the cuts and the tears in the flesh. After flashing off the spirits with a blow dryer, I'll come in with a slightly dampened brush with mineral spirits and feather the wash off from the raised areas, leaving it in the details. Moving back over to the armour and the skeleton, I'll come in for the removal pass using Q-tips, a brush and some spirits. I'll employ a couple of different techniques for the removal pass here. Initially, I'll dampen one end of the Q-tip with spirits and dab and tap at the armour plates, reactivating the wash. I'll then switch around to the dry end of the Q-tip and keep tapping and dabbing at the surface, removing the wash, leaving a really nice mottled effect. I'll then switch over to a brush and spirits for any of the more hard to reach areas or any parts that I want a cleaner, less pronounced effect. To add some contrast to the recesses in the miniature here, we're going to come in with a crevice wash using Villainy Ink Decrepit Filth. This is a really muddy, dark brown, almost black wash with lots of texture and particles when it dries, and it's quickly become one of my absolute favourites from Phase 2. My initial pass is thinned slightly with mineral spirits and applied like a general crevice wash. I'll then come back with a neat application to areas that I want the darkest shadow and a really crusty, dirty finish. I'll also use Decrepit Filth to go over the gold parts of the miniature. The particles in this wash, when it dries, give an absolutely fantastic pitted and grungy look. My first pass here is thinned roughly 1:1 with mineral spirits and applied like a filter almost, and I'll come back with a neat pass just to reinforce the brown, grungy look in all of the recesses and the crevices. After a quick blast with a blow dryer on medium heat, I'll come back for the feathering pass using Q-tips, a brush and some mineral spirits. In a similar manner to the armour, I'll begin by tapping and dabbing at the surface with a damp Q-tip, then I'll switch over to the dry side just to remove the wash and create a mottled look. And for any hard to reach areas or parts that I want cleaner than the rest, I'll switch over to a brush and spirits and feather away the excess. I find that using a brush to remove a unifying wash is an easier way to break up the hard edges, creating a nice smooth gradient and transition. Coming in for our first rust pass here, we're going to use Villainy Ink Ex Machina from Phase 2. This is a really nice mid-rust colour with a quite strong orange tone to it as well. My first application of this is applied slightly thinned to the crevices and areas that I want to build up a basic rust tone. I'll then come back with a neat application just to reinforce the saturation in certain areas. I'll then come back in with our blow dryer on medium heat for around 30 seconds so we can move on to the removal pass. Coming back in with some Q-tips and spirits, we'll feather away the edges of the wash, creating a nice smooth transition. When Ex Machina dries, you'll see that it has a wonderful, chalky, powdery, almost textured finish. Moving on to our second rust pass, we're going to come in with Villainy Ink Sector Rust. This deeper rust tone will be a really nice contrast to Ex Machina, so we apply this in a similar manner, just covering less areas than the previous step. I'll go back in for a second application in certain areas just to increase the saturation and strength of the effect. As before, I'll come back in with some spirits and a brush and just feather away at the hard edges of the wash, creating a nice smooth transition. I'm now going to come back in with some Ichor of the Damned by Villainy Ink, slightly thin with mineral spirits, as a shading pass. The satin finish associated with Ichor of the Damned means we'll add to our surface finish variation here, and I'll use this to slightly knock back the intensity of the rust steps previously applied. I'll also use this to add some extra contrast and darken the shadows on areas like the tail and on his spine as well. After a quick blast with a hairdryer, I'll come back in for a refining and cleaning pass with Q-tips and spirits. With this, I'm just aiming to clean up any areas where the wash might have overspilled onto the armour or the skeleton. We're now going to come back in and push that contrast even further by adding some sparse highlights. For the armour, I take the base colour, add some silver and thin it down so it's very translucent, remove most of the pigment from my bristles and stipple it onto the raised edges. With heavily diluted paint and a lightly loaded brush, we're not really adding any pigment to the miniature here, just bringing the shine back to the armour. Moving back over to the skeleton and the claws, we're going to use the same method here, just using the base colour plus some silver. Using a fine tip liner brush, I just come in here and add a few gradual, thin, subtle layers to bring some shine back to the upper edges. These steps will add a good amount of contrast, ranging from the dark and oily shadows to the fairly bright highlights on the metallics. And for the highlights on the gold, we come back in with the base colour once again, add a touch of silver and just concentrate on the uppermost edges. For the highlights on the red, I'm going to come in with Pro Acryl Bold Pyrrole Red and just apply a couple of very light dry brushing layers over the tubing. And with those stages complete, this is how we're looking so far. For the next step of our effects, we're going to come in and make those patches of flesh look really nasty. For this, I'm going to use a filtering pass of Villainy Ink Caput Mortuum. This is a really nice dark red, almost purplish tinted wash, and it also has a similar pigmentation to Carrion Crimson. First up, I'll come in with a slightly thin filtering pass, covering the entirety of the skin. I'll then come back in with a neat pass, just reinforcing the colour in certain areas like the crevices, the cuts and the torn areas. After 30 seconds with a blow dryer on medium heat, I'll come in with some Q-tips and spirits and gently reactivate the wash on the main parts of the flesh strips. Switching over to the dry side of the Q-tip, I'll then absorb some of the wash from the broader areas of the flesh. I'll then swap out to a brush slightly dampened with mineral spirits and use this to pick up and move around the pigmentation in the Caput Mortuum. By doing this, you'll create a really nice varied and mottled finish on the skin. To add some fresh gore effects to the flesh here, I'm going to come in with Villainy Ink Carrion Crimson. This pass is diluted slightly and added to the areas that I wanted a fresh blood effect, such as the torn edges and the holes. Once again, after a quick blow dry, I'll come in with a brush lightly loaded with mineral spirits and begin tapping and dabbing at the flesh panels, removing any Carrion Crimson from the centre of the areas. Once that's done, I'll go in and pick up some of the pigmentation from Carrion Crimson and gently move it around, creating a mottled and varied surface finish. Using this method you can create some really realistic and varied finishes. Just pick a little up, move it about, rinse and repeat until you're happy with the results. To add another layer of visual interest and some extra gore onto the flesh, I'll come back with neat Carrion Crimson, applied in a stippling manner along the edges, the tears, the cuts and the holes. For the first step of our oxidation here, we're going to come in with a 1-to-1 mix of Villainy Ink, Colia Green and All Is Dust. All Is Dust is a lovely slate grey, highly textured and pigmented wash. By adding this to Colia Green and thinning it slightly with mineral spirits, it will give it a really nice crusty and decrepit verdigris style effect. As we hit this wash with a blow dryer, you can watch it turn into a chalky, dirty and dusty finish right before your eyes. To add some more visual interest into this oxidation, I'm going to come in with a neat pass of Colia Green. I'll concentrate this more vibrant colour towards the recesses and in random patches in a stippling manner. The particles found in Colia Green will also add to this verdigris effect. Coming in with some spirits and a Q-tip here, we're just going to do a quick and fairly light removal pass, mainly concentrating on the upper portions of the cape. To add some extra contrast and visual interest into the areas of verdigris, we're going to come in with a lining wash of 1-to-1 Ikra the Damned and Colia Green, slightly thin with mineral spirits. I apply this with a fine tip brush just to the very deepest recesses and areas of shadow. Another layer of effects we can add on here is some really old and crusty rust. For this we're going to use Dirty Down rust, slightly diluted with water. Using a lightly loaded brush, I'll build up multiple thin layers of this, gradually increasing the intensity and saturation of the colour. I'll reserve this application for the areas that I want to show the oldest and the heaviest corrosion. For the final effect on the rust here, we're going to come in with some neat Dirty Down. I'm going to cover less area than the previous step here and apply it very thick so it dries with a crusty texture and a really dark finish. On certain areas like the claws, I'll load up my brush, wipe most of it from the bristles and then apply it in a stippling manner to give a really pitted and corroded look. To add another layer of visual interest and some more surface finish variation onto the patches of flesh, we're going to come in with Carrion Crimson once again. For this application I'll decant some onto my flat palette and leave it for around 30 to 40 minutes until it begins to evaporate and harden up. I'll then use a little bit of mineral spirits on a brush to reactivate some of this and pick up the chunky mixture and apply it just to the extreme edges and where I want the freshest gore. For the final steps here, and just to punch up that contrast a little bit further, we're going to come in and add some slight battle damage and scratching. For this I'm using Vallejo Silver, thinned fairly heavily with a lightly loaded brush. I come in along the leading edges and places that would normally attract scratching and damage and gently paint fine lines and small dots. Less is more with this step, we don't want to go too crazy, just pick out a certain few areas to draw the eye. We'll repeat the same process here for the gold parts, using the base mix plus Vallejo Silver, just focusing on the uppermost edges. For the final effect here, and to add some more visual interest and surface finish variation, we're going to add some sparse highlights onto the areas of skin. For this I take Abtalung 502 light flesh tone, thin it down with some spirits and lightly load my brush. I wipe most of the pigment off the bristles on the back of my glove and then apply it in a stippling and dry brushing manner over the central portions of the skin. This will give an extremely smooth blend. This step can be repeated a couple of times just to increase the intensity and opacity of the colour. Moving on to the base, I'm going to apply a slightly thin mix of Villainy Ink Blighted Bone Ochre onto the skulls and bones. This is a really nice warm ochre tone that dries with a dead matte finish. I apply this pretty heavily, I'm not really fussed about it settling in the crevices either. I'll then add some decrepit filth into the Blighted Bone Ochre and use this as a crevice wash, just darkening up the eye sockets and the areas around the skulls. As a unifying wash for the remainder of the base, I'm going to take some decrepit filth, thin it down very slightly and apply it as a liberal wash. I'll follow this up with a neat application and reserve this just for the crevices and darkest areas. I'll then give everything a blast with a blow dryer or medium heat for around 30 seconds or so. Just a quick removal pass here using Q-tips and spirits. I'll focus mainly on the tops of the skulls, leaving the effect of the wash fairly heavy on the rest of the base. To help give the look of an ancient and dusty tomb world, we're going to come in with Villainy Ink All Is Dust. I apply this in 2 to 3 fairly thick layers, stippling it on in random patches, making sure to catch the bottom of his legs, his feet and the bottom of the cape to tie him into the base. When All His Dust dries, it gives a wonderful, full matte, chalky and slightly dusty finish with lots of texture, which is absolutely ideal for the look we're trying to achieve here. To help sell the ancient tomb world look, we're going to come in with some Villainy Ink Decay of Death. I apply this neat from the bottle and concentrate this mainly on and around the skulls and the bones. To finish things off today, we're going to come in with a couple of dry pigment applications. The first one is MIG Russian Earth. Using an old brush, I apply this to the majority of the gravel areas on the base, making sure to hit the bottom of his legs and his feet, and also the cape and the skulls to tie them in a bit. I'll then come in with the Abtalung Ashes Grey, concentrating more on the rocky parts of the base, but also making sure to hit his feet and the bottom parts of the miniature once again. And here we have the end result, a grimdark, ancient and terrifying Necron Flayed One Lord. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video. For many more like it, including an in-depth look at all of the techniques discussed today, head over to the Grimdark Compendium, where pre-orders for Phase 2 of Villainy Ink are now open. You'll also be able to pick up some fantastic offers in our winter sale. I bid you a good week, keep it grim, and I'll see you next time.